But I believe that by overwhelming majority in all the Americas, you and I, in the long run, and if it be necessary, you and I will act together to protect, to defend, by every means at our command.
Welcome to the History in Motion podcast, where we discuss leaders, their decisions, and how they shape the world we live in today.
He was a soldier, a strategist, and a political mastermind. Constantine didn't just win power, he redefined it. From his sudden rise through civil war to his bold embrace of Christianity, he changed how emperors ruled and what they ruled for. In this episode, we trace the man behind the myth and how Constantine reshaped Rome, religion, and history itself. This is the History in Motion podcast.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the History in Motion podcast, where we are continuing our story into the later Roman Empire and moving to Emperor Constantine, or better known as Constantine the Great. And Richie, I think this is the big one, right? This is the one that when we look at a Roman emperor that, most people would know and maybe has, if we're looking at legacy in terms of impact on the Western world, I don't think anyone even comes close to Constantine in terms of impact. But I think with him, kind of gets glossed over as the man behind, Constantine, Christianity, put the two together and we move on. There's a lot more going on here. But what I think is so interesting that we're going to talk about today is not just about Constantine himself, but, we just talked about last week about Diocletian and these great persecutions against Christians. And now we're going to jump right into an emperor who is going to convert to Christianity and really shift the empire into a more Christian empire. So you're probably thinking, wow, this is 100 years later, 200 years later. Not even close. We're talking decades, even less than a decade between, the death of Diocletian and when Constantine gets full control of the empire. So this is a very quick change. And I think that's probably what I'm most excited to talk about today.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to cover in this episode, just given the breadth of what happens in such a short amount of time. It's interesting because we've done a few of these episodes now, and we haven't really touched too much on religion, specifically Christianity. Whereas within this episode, I don't think we could even come close to doing an episode like this without providing enough context and historical background on Christianity, because the story of Constantine is so coupled with the growth and rise of Christianity that to do one without the other would be, very poor historical analysis in my perspective.
Yeah, and that's what we're here to talk about anyways, right? Is, Constantine is going to shape the empire in a way that is so radically different than what we are known to seeing up to this point with the Roman Empire. But then we're going to look at the next pretty much to the present day history of the Western Roman world and even the Mediterranean as a whole. It's all going to be based in Christianity, the splitting of Christianity, Catholicism, and then Islam rising in the Middle East and moving and having that great clash between Western Europe and East, between the Muslims and Christians. So it all really starts here because prior to this is the world of pagans, Roman pagans, Greek pagan, customs, gods, those sort of things. And, this transition is starting to happen very slowly. But like we said, it just seems like there needed to be a little bit of a spark or maybe a little bit more of, guidance from the top, if you will, to get us to the point where we start to see Christianity become, the religion of the Roman Empire. And I think that's what Constantine's about to do.
Yeah. So let's get into it. So just as a bit of a preamble to kind of lay the foundation again. So let's start with where Rome is at. So not a lot of time has passed since our last episode, but just for context. So before Constantine the Great ever marched under the sign of the cross, before he was called the 13th apostle, and we'll talk about why he's called that, and long before his name became synonymous with, this Christian empire, Rome stood on some pretty shaky legs. And I think we keep repeating that motif because they're always on the edge of disaster. The world he inherited, it's still somewhat fractured, it's exhausted, and it's reeling from nearly a century of crisis. So to understand Constantine, we really need to understand the empire he stepped into. So it's the early 4th century CE. The Roman Empire at one point was the undisputed ruler of the known world. But, it was no longer this kind of unshakable force of Augustus and Trajan. Instead, you could kind of call it this like wounded colossus in some ways. It's trying to stitch itself back together after, a terrifying collapse, and it spread very thin. We've talked about what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, which had left Rome bruised and bloodied, from 235 to 284 CE. Emperors came and went like shadows. Over 20 men had claimed the purple in just 5 decades. Most died very violently. Civil wars were constant, with generals rising from the provinces only to be assassinated or overthrown. And then meanwhile, on the frontier, you have Germanic tribes, Persian armies hammering the borders. On top of that, you have internal revolts threatened what little stability kind of remained. So the empire is, somewhat, on the precipice of collapse. In the west, a breakaway Gallic empire is forming. In the east, Queen Zenobia's Palmyrian Empire challenged Roman authority. And these weren't just rogue governors. These were alternate Romes, essentially. Then came Diocletian. So we covered him in our last episode, and he's a soldier emperor with a reformer's mind. In 293, he introduced the Tetrarchy. This is the rule of 4. Essentially, 2 senior emperors, Augusti, and 2 juniors, Caesars, would divide the sprawling empire, hoping to provide, local leadership and rapid military response. So in theory, a very strategic, very tactical approach to governance. Diocletian ruled from Nicomedia in the east, far from the old capital of Rome. And I will just put an asterisk there for our listeners, because I think this is going to be a topic that we cover later in this episode. His system brought, temporary order, but relied heavily on personal loyalty and stability, both of which, as you can assume, would quickly unravel after that loyalty and trust isn't there. And it certainly did after his abdication of the throne in the year 305. So by the time Constantine comes into the picture, the Tetrarchy is already buckling. Power struggles are ignited as rival emperors keep fighting for supremacy. And it's not just one empire anymore. It was several men claiming to be the true ruler, all backed by regional armies. And this is a story that we continue to tell as we do episodes on Rome. And amid the chaos, Constantine is proclaimed emperor by his troops in York in 306 CE after the death of his father. But again, politics aren't the only battlefield. And this is where things get a little different from our other episodes. The cultural and religious landscape of Rome is rapidly shifting beneath his own feet. Like you mentioned, Paul, paganism is still dominating public life, but Christianity is rapidly rising. The faith had endured periodic persecution under Diocletian. We talked about the great persecution of the Christians, who saw the new religion as a threat to imperial unity, and yet it refused to die. But by Constantine's time, Christians made up a significant, if still persecuted, portion of the empire's population. And at the same time, the center of gravity in the empire is moving away from Rome. Power is now somewhat decentralized. Emperors ruled from Trier, Milan, Nicomedia, Antioch. The old heart of the empire had become more symbolic than strategic. And economically, the empire is still pretty fragile. You have decades of inflation, disrupted trade, and a shrinking population had eroded Rome's former prosperity. Diocletian's reforms, like those tax changes and price controls, although good in theory, had only partially stabilized things. Militarily, the empire was tense and stretched. The legions were overworked. Frontiers, again, are constantly under threat. And the generals are acting like independent warlords. So loyalty to Rome is kind of becoming secondary to loyalty to one's commander. So in essence, what did Constantine inherit? I wouldn't necessarily call it a golden age by any means, but more of a crossroads. I think it was an empire in need of unity, a people in search of stability, and potentially a faith, Christianity, that was poised to change everything. So in many ways, I don't think he inherited just an empire, but he inherited, we can call it a mission to hold together what could easily fall apart again. And he wasn't just a soldier or a politician. He was kind of a bridge between old and new, between pagan and Christian, between the Rome that had been and the Byzantium that would be.
Yeah, that's a fantastic summary. I think you really see this transition, right, of Rome at its brink. It's falling apart militarily to start, invasions from the north, breakaway empires, like you said, and Aurelian's able to bring that back together. Okay, now we have some stability, but the economy is a mess. The administration is a mess. Diocletian's able to bring all of that back together. And, I think from a Diocletian standpoint, I've got this Tetrarchy. I'm bringing back, old school paganism. I've got these two things that everybody's going to love, and it's going to, if it's up to him, it's going to stay there forever. And it's kind of crazy with the amount of influence Diocletian has, how quickly we're going to see the Tetrarchy fall apart, which even falls apart in his own life. And not only go from, hey, old school paganism is the way to go, and Christianity is not even that it's not the way to go. It's so bad that we're actually going to start persecuting people for building churches and actually openly worshiping Christianity and not following the traditional pagan sacrifices and those sort of things, to the fact where not only is it tolerated, but it's actively being promoted by the emperor of the Roman Empire. Like, it's such a quick change. But to your point of, is Constantine inheriting a golden age? Maybe not quite in the Pax Romana type of world, because there still is this, I'll just say the Romans still love a good civil war at this point. I really look at this time period and I say, how many battles are the Romans fighting outside of their territory? It's very few. It's not the same as it once was, where Romans were always going across the border to fight the Parthians or to fight the Germanic tribes or just to conquer new territory. And so we're seeing still a lot of that fighting internally, but I've seen some historians make this connection. And I really like it. It's if you see an emperor starting to talk about invading Persia, so either the Parthian Empire or the Sassanid Empire, which is the successor kingdom, it usually means things are pretty good, because that's an expensive campaign. And it's one that the Romans just like to do. Let's go fight our old foe, because it's going to be a good battle. They got a lot of money, be able to bring something back. And you start to see some of these intermediary emperors do it. And even Constantine starts planning to do this near the end of his life. So we're definitely at a point where, the foundations are set to have a pretty stable empire. But the biggest thing is this Tetrarchy. It's so shaky, and it really relies on Diocletian being alive and well and in power to be able to do some of these things and keep everything together. And like we talked about last time, he's retiring. Him and Maximian have retired and stepped down, and now it's time to elevate, the next group of Augusti, and then create two new Caesars, which we shall see is not going to be a straightforward process. So that's the world he's coming into. And I think, there's enough here that if you're ambitious and want to do something radical, you can, but you're going to have to deal with these other three people within this Tetrarchy to be able to get it done. And we'll see very quickly where Constantine's going to look at this and go, well, I'm not a big fan of this Tetrarchy nonsense. And, it'd be a little bit better if maybe it was two people. And then eventually, maybe it'd be better if it was just one person. If that person was me, that would be lovely. And we're going to start to see very quickly how Constantine is not a fan of, the established way of things in any stretch of the imagination.
And I think you touched on something so interesting here that'll bring me to my next point. Just to take that kind of backdrop approach one step further. We talked about a crossroads for Rome. So, I think we were taking that from a very political perspective, but there's also another crossroads. It's a bit of a spiritual one. So by the time that Constantine rose to power, the religious fabric of the Roman Empire is very diverse, but it's also fragmented. The Roman religions, once kind of the bedrock of civic life, had grown kind of stale, and it was more ritual than reverence. I think that's a very important point. The old gods of Jupiter, Mars, Minerva still received sacrifices and state honors, but belief in their divine power had faded. And this is where Christianity starts to play a massive role. And I think, to your point, he wasn't a fan of the way that things were working. He needed an opportunity. And I think we'll save this part of the discussion because it's a fascinating one for a little later in the episode. But how opportunistic was he when he saw Christianity as an opportunity to kind of solidify the empire and his power? But before that, if we look at Christianity, even before Constantine, so at the turn of the 4th century, Christianity is kind of a paradox. It's everywhere, but it's nowhere officially. It's persecuted, it's growing, but it's also fragile, but it's also extremely resilient. And so in many ways, it's kind of this underground current that's threatening to reshape the bedrock of Roman life. By the time Constantine comes to power in 306 CE, Christianity had already existed for nearly 3 centuries. Right? So it survived the crucifixion of Jesus under the Roman rule, the missionary travels of Paul, and the slow expansion from this very small Jewish sect in Palestine to a religion with followers stretching from North Africa to Gaul, from Syria to Spain. But it also endured waves of brutal persecution, which we just touched on. You have some local, mob-driven, others sanctioned by emperors like Diocletian. The most severe came under him just a few years before Constantine's rise. And this was, one of the last and most systematic attempts to crush the Christian faith. Churches were destroyed, scriptures were burned, clergy were imprisoned. Christians who refused to offer sacrifices to the Roman gods or to the divine image of the emperor were tortured and executed. The aim was not just to suppress the religion, it was to erase it. But it didn't work. Christianity proved remarkably resilient. And I'm sure our listeners, like I did, are asking themselves why. And that is a great question. I don't think there's any one answer to it because it's very multifaceted and it's very complicated. But its followers were essentially connected by a very powerful spiritual narrative of suffering and salvation. But pragmatically speaking, it's also connected by a network of bishops, deacons, and communities that functioned outside of official Roman structures. So persecution in some ways may have hardened their identity and strengthened their resolve. Martyrs became heroes. The memory of sacrifice kind of became the sacred history of Christianity. And by the time of Constantine's rule, Christians likely made up anywhere from 10 to 15% of the population in some parts of the empire. It's likely it was higher in urban centers like Antioch, Alexandria, and Carthage, but they weren't just poor or marginal either. Some Christians held wealth, land, and even positions in government, though they probably practiced pretty quietly for the most part because it still remained illegal. And it was not just a religion in some ways, it was a pretty fundamental challenge to Roman values. Christians refused to worship the emperor. They rejected many pagan festivals and were often accused of being atheists or enemies of Rome. Their exclusive monotheism was seen as antisocial. Their secret meetings and refusal to sacrifice to state gods made them targets. But here's the twist that kind of ties into my earlier point that the empire itself is changing. While Christianity was still on the margins, traditional Roman religion was weakening. The old pantheon of gods no longer inspired the same devotion. People still sacrificed and prayed, but it's likely that fewer people truly believed. Religion had become somewhat transactional, and Christianity now comes as this kind of platform to offer meaning, purpose, and a tight-knit community. So Constantine, this very ambitious son of a Roman emperor, might have saw this, and, he'd been relatively tolerant of Christians, and he's probably may have recognized that the future Rome might lie within this growing faith, not because of theology, but because of unity. Christianity offered what the empire desperately needed: a single God, a single moral order, and a single universal truth. So when we talk about Constantine rose to power, even though Christianity isn't as dominant as it's going to be because it's still illegal, it's divided, and it's vulnerable, but it's growing everywhere, and it's growing quietly, through homes, through catacombs, even despite centuries of persecution. But it continued to grow stronger. So beyond, this belief, the church develops a very resilient underground structure with these bishops and deacons that continue to function outside of these systems. And by the time that Constantine, arrives on the scene, it's no longer this fringe cult. It's disciplined, it's organized, and it's this morally cohesive force that's been shaped and hardened by the very persecutions that were meant to destroy it.
Yeah, when we look at Christianity, we really see for a time, right? So we're talking around Constantine's born in 272, so Christ is born in the year zero, if you will. And, it's only about 250 years or so by the time Constantine's coming on the scene that Christ has died. And then, the religion has really grown more from just the offset of Judaism. But it really was this religion of just women and slaves. That's how it was always thought of. But now the very patriarchal Romans are starting to see high-ranking men convert to Christianity, or at least have some sympathy towards Christianity. And like you said, Richie, this is no longer this backroom sort of cult, if you will. It's starting to become, more official in the eyes of many people, especially in the East. And, like you said, there's bishops and deacons, and it's starting to get some meat behind it. And there's a couple of theories that I've seen that I really like on why was this catching on so much. First off, with women and slaves, they were not given a role in Roman society outside of, a slave to his master and really a woman to, creating more Roman boys to go fight in wars. Really, it was kind of how they were looked upon. And, going from the old pantheon of Roman gods to this religion that says, hey, guess what? You're just as equal as everybody else. When the poor, when they get to heaven, they will be rewarded. And there's little things like that where there's this charitable element, there's looking out for everybody. And it's a very attractive thing to a lot of people versus the much more, I would say, humanist kind of versions of the old gods where, you see them be jealous, you see them have favoritism, you see them fighting each other. This kind of has a bit of a nicer story, especially if you're someone not in a good place. And then number two is the crisis of the 3rd century. It's awful. There is civil war on top of civil war. Death is all over the place, terrible plagues. It's just not a good time to be a Roman. So to your point, Richie, about, hey, well, religion's starting to slip. It's more transactional. This might be part of it, is things aren't going very well. And it's like an election, like I'm going to pick somebody else. And now there's this new religion coming along and, hey, it's starting to get a little bit of traction and things are actually starting to get a little bit better. And maybe I'm going to start changing who I pray to. And maybe that's going to make a difference. And I think that played a key role as well of, the change in message, but also just the change in circumstance and really feeling that the old gods had abandoned a lot of Romans. It's definitely playing a factor here in, why they would shift over.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. I don't think there's any one definitive answer, but just like based on the research and my own takeaways, I think it's a message that resonated with people. It has a moral and social appeal in this changing world. It seems to be very resilient and adaptive. And to your earlier point about being able to kind of meet people where they are, slaves, women, etc., there is kind of this universalism and mission that I think would be very appealing to, the mass population. And then the fifth part of this kind of analysis that I would take away, which I think, timing is always very important, is the historical timing. It's arising when those traditional structures were cracking: civil war, plagues, economic collapse. The old gods who are tied to these civic rituals, what are they really doing for us right now? Not much. Maybe there's something better.
Yeah, and I'm sure Constantine's seeing that himself, right? And so I think now's a good time to bring him into the scene here, because we've established this now that the empire's in a pretty good spot. Christianity is starting to rise. Paganism is falling away. Two major emperors, I guess earlier we have some other people in there as well, but Aurelian worshipping Sol Invictus, the sun god, flirting with monotheism and actually making his feast day December 25th. So we're already kind of on our way a little bit, just in some small spots, but let's get to Constantine. So he's born in 272 in modern day Serbia. So again, another Illyrian/Balkan emperor, Aurelian, Diocletian, and now Constantine, all born in the frontier Danube-ish area provinces, battle-hardened, best troops. The army picks the emperor. Of course, they're going to be from the Balkans. So again, that's where Constantine's born. And he's born to the son of Constantius, who is a Caesar, a Western Caesar within the Tetrarchy. And so as a way for Diocletian to kind of keep this Tetrarchy whole, he doesn't want, I would say it's maybe not so much as a prisoner, but it's kind of like you see this in history where it's like, you send us your son to work in our court. So that's what Diocletian does to Constantine. Constantine moves into the courts mostly of Galerius, who is the Caesar in the east, and then eventually becomes Augustus, and basically works and lives there. So he doesn't actually spend a lot of time with his father in the west, and it's kind of a way to balance things out a little bit. Constantine, you get closer to Galerius, and Constantius, hey, if you think about doing anything funny, remember I have my son in your court. And you would kind of see this swap, and it's kind of a bit of a hostage sort of maneuver, but it kind of worked for what they were needing to do. And so we're at this point where Constantius is, doing what he needs to do in the West. And then eventually Diocletian and Maximian abdicate, and Constantius is elevated to Augustus in the West. And so at this point, Constantine decides he wants to get closer to his father. He sees an opportunity here where he knows he's not going to be able to get anything in the East being close to Galerius, because Galerius is going to favor people who are closer to him. And there's this East-West divide. So in kind of a daring escape, Constantine actually flees this eastern court in the year 306 and essentially makes his way all the way to the west to link up with his father. And, Galerius actually tries to get him back, but Constantine kind of makes this daring escape to the west. It sounds like a bit of like a jailbreak, prisoner break, if you will. It's not quite that, but it also kind of is. Part of this was, I think Galerius was waiting for Constantius to die first, and then he can kind of decide what he wants to do with Constantine. But Constantine, I think, is clever enough to see what's going on. And also Constantius is starting to fight in northern Gaul, which is France today. And then he's about to move into Britain. And so there's an opportunity here for some action. And this is huge, right? This is Rome. You got to have battlefield victories to be able to do well. So, he moves west secretly at night. It's a really daring escape. And the story goes that he actually would cripple the imperial horses at each station that he was going to. So anybody behind him was essentially couldn't use the horses, which is a bit cruel, but this might be a run for his life or a ride for his life. So he's not messing around, but he needed to get to his father in in Gaul at the time to help him on his British campaign. And, that was really the goal. And, this is the power politics of the Tetrarchy. It seems like, hey, we're a big, happy family of four, but in situations like this where someone's son wants to leave a court, it's got to be at night under the cover of darkness and very sneakily, and something that Galerius is not going to be too happy about.
I think the point that we made earlier in this episode, in the episode where we discussed Diocletian and the Tetrarchy, that the power balance is such a fine one, right? That if there is some embedded loyalty and trust across the Augustuses and the Caesars, that you could potentially have something that is a little, a bit more long lasting and enduring. But as soon as that trust is no longer there, the entire system can fail.
And that's exactly what happens. So as we kind of move forward here, we talked about it with Diocletian. He comes out of retirement. Maximian comes back in the West. He kind of goes, hey, I want to get back involved. But his son Maxentius is in charge, and there's kind of this, it just gets really messy, and we're not going to get into all the details today, but there's a lot of people rising up and falling down, and a bunch of different things happen. But really the main thing is Constantine's up in Britain. He's even campaigning north of Hadrian's Wall into modern day Scotland, and he's getting, his true first taste of proper campaigning. And this is huge for a future emperor, and doing quite well from the sounds of it. But not too long after he joins, his father, Constantius, dies. And so what's going to happen with Constantine? Well, his army, like always at this point in the Roman Empire, the army picks the emperors. And right away, they actually raise him to Augustus, full emperor of the West. And this is very unconventional at this time. It completely violates Diocletian's succession scheme. And now you've kind of got this thing like, what's Galerius supposed to do in the East? He's sitting there going, well, okay, if I say you're not emperor in the West, that's a civil war, and I'm getting old. I really don't want that. So he kind of makes a compromise, and he puts him as he says, I'll make you a junior Caesar. So, you're in the pecking order, but I can't make you Augustus. And Constantine goes, great, but too bad. My troops have just elevated me to Augustus. That's what I'm going to do. And you get a little bit of a gray area for a bit, but over the next few years, what do you think happens? More civil war kicks off. So everything Diocletian was trying to avoid, all it needed was one person's troops to say, hey, guess what? I don't care. We're doing what we want. And so that's what happens. So he secures Britain and Gaul. And then we have other claimants to the Rome. We have Maxentius in Rome. We have Maximinius in the East. Galerius dies at this point, and it's just a big mess. And nobody knows who's in charge. The West, the East, everyone's kind of fighting over each other. But really, it comes down to war. Who's going to win this battle? So about the point of 6 years, there's a lot of back and forth, people trying to gain alliances, all of these things. But we need a decisive battle. And that's what we're going to get in the year 312. And this is the big one. This is the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. So Constantine marches into Italy to challenge Maxentius, who's the son of Maximilian. And this is big because, Constantine needs to win this battle to secure power in the West. And it's kind of interesting we're seeing another battle in Italy here. I feel like we haven't had a good Italian civil war battle in a while. But what's really important about this is before this great battle, Constantine has a dream. And in this dream, he's directed that a heavenly sign is basically telling him to mark his shields with a certain inscription. Well, not inscription, as a symbol. And he sees under this inscription the words "conquer by this." And basically this symbol is called the labarum, also known as the Chi-Rho symbol, which is a monogram for the first two letters in Greek for Christ. So basically looks like CR kind of. Long story short, he's told in a vision to put this Christian symbol, or what we now say today is a Christian symbol, and we'll get into all that in a second, on his troops' shields. Because if you do this, you're going to win the battle, be pro-Christian God, and everything's going to work out well for you. And that's what he goes and does. And guess what? He wins the battle. So now what happens? This is a huge thing because this symbol is there. His troops see it. He sees it. And now we start thinking a little bit around, was Constantine just chosen by God to rule the Roman Empire and become the ultimate ruler here as a Christian emperor potentially? Who knows? That's the questions that are starting to go around because remember, the Romans are very, very superstitious. And if this guy's been picked by God, my goodness, why would I not back him? Of course I'm going to back him. And those are the things that people are going to start asking about. And, winning this battle, yes, it's a big battle to win, but the symbolism around it is really going to change everything.
It's such a convenient story, and it's lovely in that sense. But I think this is probably a nice little segue into, his belief system. And this is something that I don't think historians have an answer one way or the other on. How true of a believer was he, or was he just a shrewd tactician? And I think the answer is somewhere in the middle, as it always is. And it's probably important to note that his conversion was kind of a gradual process rather than this kind of instantaneous transformation. He didn't receive baptism until 337. So this is actually just before his death. And this is actually a pretty common practice back then because people believed that it was better to delay baptism until late in life so you could kind of repent all of your sin in your last days and, enter heaven with a clean slate, which, I can appreciate that thinking. But despite this delay, he continued, I think, to increasingly identify with Christianity. He started praying in Christian services. He called himself a servant of God. He intervened in church affairs. Some we'll get into later. Some later chronicles, even, he would embellish his conversion story. There's a medieval legend claiming that Pope Sylvester had baptized Constantine and cured him of leprosy. Obviously, there's no evidence to actually indicate that this happened. But again, you can see the myth, the narrative start to build. And this is one of those kind of core debates within his legacy, which is the sincerity and depth of his personal faith. Did he actually convert out of genuine spiritual conviction, or were his motives more politically pragmatic? And like I said earlier, I think it's probably a bit of both. Constantine did favor the Christian church, ending its persecution, as we'll get into, but some modern scholars still debate that his beliefs and even his comprehension of Christianity would waver depending on what issues he was looking at.
Yeah, it's a great question. One will unfortunately never know the answer to, but I think you're right. It has to be somewhere within the middle. He would be very silly to not use it as a political tool because it's so powerful, but to fake it for his entire life and be that convincing, maybe he's a great actor, but I doubt that. I definitely think, there's probably some mix there. And, he's learning about all this as he goes along too, and he's trying to figure things out, but he's won this battle now. He's got the opportunity now to become the sole Augustus in the West, and that's what he does. And he actually goes to Rome here. So this is kind of big because, like we talked about before, Diocletian went to Rome and didn't really spend a lot of time there and didn't really like it. But Constantine goes there. And if you go to Rome today, you actually see the Arch of Constantine, which is a huge arch outside of the Colosseum. And now something that's very interesting about this that I was reading was you would think if you looked at that, it would be covered in Christian symbols. He just won this big battle of the Milvian Bridge by, seeing this barum in the sky, and he's putting it on his shields, but there's no Christian symbols at all on this arch. And so this is where people are saying, well, maybe he wasn't actually Christian and blah, blah, blah. Well, the challenge here, though, is the Senate is still part of this creation of this arch. They're giving him support. And you kind of actually see this arch. You see symbols from Trajan and Hadrian and the older emperors. It's kind of being used to connect this more modern emperor to the great emperors of the past. And so I think it is more of a way for him to play kind of that more traditional Roman side of things without jumping to this new cool thing, this new religion everybody's going to love, right? He's trying to bring things back and keep things a little bit more grounded. And we'll see with Constantine, he does a very, very good job throughout his life of towing the line. He definitely promotes Christianity for sure, no question about it, but he doesn't actively go hard against anything pagan. If you want to worship and be pagan, that's great. I'm still going to keep the Pontifex Maximus, which is this really prestigious, very old Roman office, basically like a high priest, essentially. And he's going to keep that around. There's no reason to get rid of it in his eyes. So he does a very good job of keeping this together, but ultimately, he's really consolidated his power in the West. But what's happening over in the East? Well, just maybe about 5 years before this battle of the Milvian Bridge, someone named Licinius is brought up to be is the Caesar currently at that time in the East, and Galerius elevates him to Augustus. And so really at this time, it's Constantine in the West and Licinius, and then someone named Maximinus Daia in the East. They have a fight. Licinius wins, and he becomes the sole ruler of the Eastern Roman Empire. So again, still the same empire, but just kind of spheres of influence, not the official split that we'll see in the next 100 years or so. But really, the West is run by Constantine and the East is run by Licinius, and they have a decent relationship for the most part. And people are starting to say, okay, maybe there's some stability here. And we'll get into how things are going to change, pretty quickly. But the two meet in Milan in 313. And the first thing they do is Constantine actually has Licinius marry his half-sister Constantia. So great. This is, traditional marriage, keeping things together, keeping things in the family, really solidifying that alliance. But this is where they do a really big thing, and that's the Edict of Milan. So, Rich, maybe you can take us through this because this is a big deal, right? This is the edict that, we just went from prosecution of Christians not too long ago to this edict that, is pretty much going to legalize Christianity across the empire.
And I think it's one step further than that, because I think it definitely does do that, but then it also provides religious autonomy and freedom for everybody else. So no one religion is singled out anymore. And I think that is key, because I think that really talks to the political shrewdness of both of these guys. So in 13, I almost did the same thing. In 313, shortly after his victory, Constantine takes this massive step and implements the Edict of Milan. It essentially proclaims religious liberty throughout the Roman Empire, and it's the culmination of this meeting between these two parties, and they agree upon principles of toleration as a part of a broader political understanding. And the edict is renowned for its sweeping guarantee of freedom of worship. Now, quote unquote, our purpose as announced, is to grant both to the Christians and to all others full authority to follow whatever worship each person has desired, so that no person whatsoever should be refused complete toleration in matters of religion. Practically speaking, this edict does legalize Christianity, which up until this point had been an illegal religion pretty much on and off, and also protected all other religions from persecution. And it explicitly ordered that confiscated Christian properties, church buildings, lands, other assets seized during the Great Persecution would be returned to the Christians without compensation required from them. If current holders of the property claim losses, they were to seek redress from the state, and the edict emphasized fairness. No diminution must be made from the honor of any religion, it declared, underscoring that the goal was universal religious neutrality by the state. And that is quite a sweeping reform, and I think politically a very intelligent move, as we'll see. And I think, to our earlier point of, was he a true believer or was he a shrewd politician? I think this is probably a notch or a tick under the, true believer stance to some degree, because this does, kind of lay the foundation for what's going to happen next with the formalization of Christianity.
Yeah, and you'll even see him build upon this later on, where he's even saying, okay, yes, you have to give all the property back to the Christians that was stolen during their great persecutions. But he's also kind of throws some stuff in, and I can't recall if this was exactly in the Edict of Milan or if it came after, but regardless of that, it proves the point that he even goes to the level of saying, I'm not going to punish anybody who purchased land from, an auction that was taken. So if land was taken from a Christian during the persecution and was sold off by the state, if you bought that land, don't worry, you can give it back and I won't even punish you for buying it. And if you're someone who bought it, like, I bought this thing legally, like the state said I could do it. There's just a little piece there to say you shouldn't even have done it to begin with, because this was so unjust and this should never have happened. And so you see this, it's a complete change. And this may sound like, is this the official change? Is the Roman Empire Christian? Not officially, but it, like you said, it now opens the floodgates to say, be Christian in any way that you want. Obviously, other religions are now officially tolerated, but there's harsh penalties if you try to harm, converts, Christian slaves even as well, which, will change over time. But this is a big one, right? This is really changing things. And Licinius being there with him is very important too, because now the West and the East are aligned on this great change, and there's more Christians in the East than there are in the West. So that's going to be also very important too. And, you see this really start to quickly move across the empire. And you start to see now some building projects, churches are being built at the state expense, which is completely new for this time period. But all good things have a little bit, not to say all good things have to come to an end. This kumbaya of, hey, you know what? We just, we're going to get together. You got the West, I got the East. We're going to do this edict. It's going to be great. But Constantine, he wants control. And you'll continue to see that. He does not stop trying to poke Licinius in certain ways. And we'll see how he kind of throws some things back at him to say, hey, you're doing some things that I need to, go deal with. But really the power struggles begin almost a year later, and even maybe a little bit after that as well, where we start to see the first battle between Constantine and Licinius. And so there are a few battles, but essentially Licinius kind of never gets decisively defeated. He continues to move east, and then, Constantine and Licinius actually sign a temporary peace, and Constantine actually takes more influence over a few different regions such as Pannonia and Macedonia. So again, moving east into the more Greek areas and moving closer to Asia. And now they're kind of chilling again for the most part. They're having this coexistence, but it's very uneasy. And it lasts for about 3 or 4 years, and things are starting to move along, but that it's going to kick off at some point again. And so in 320, Licinius allegedly reneged on the Edict of Milan by taking measures against Christians, dismissing Christian officials, forbidding church councils, and generally oppressing Christians. And so people say, well, Licinius, he's a pagan at heart. He's looking at this Christian church as this extra influence charged by Constantine. And you know what? It can't have this. This is going to really ruin my dominion, I guess, over the East. Now, that is a very convenient story if you want to go invade the East, but it may be partially true. We don't exactly know for sure based on this time period, but we're really at a point now where, Licinius is seen as an enemy of Christianity. Constantine is the savior of Christianity. There needs to be a battle for all time, in the next few years to really straighten this thing out.
And this is in 324.
Yep. So in the 320s, when these, alleged rumors start floating around, and then we get that open war, in 324.
It's interesting because I think, again, now we're really seeing, I don't want to call it an agenda essentially, but this coupling of his political movement and decision-making with Christianity. And maybe just to jump the gun a little bit, and I think this, again, probably another notch under the true believer, column of Christianity when we're talking about Constantine, is the Council of Nicaea. So this actually happens just a year later in 325. And this is very interesting. And I think, why would anyone who's not a true believer take it upon themselves to essentially create the first Council of Nicaea, where he's going to gather bishops from across the empire to resolve the Arian controversy? Essentially, without getting into the theological debates and philosophy here, essentially it was to align the church on the divinity of Christ. He didn't dictate doctrine, but he acted as a convener, sponsor, and kind of honorary, president to urge these deacons and bishops, for the sake of both religious truth and imperial stability, to agree upon the divinity of Christ. Was he the same as God? Was he created by God? Et cetera, because he wanted a unified message and story that could kind of coalesce across the empire. And he enforced this decision by actually exiling Arius and others who kind of perpetuated this narrative that Christ was not divine in the way that people consider God divine. And this move kind of established a pretty large precedent, is that the emperor as not just a political ruler, but a guardian of church unity. And this model, as we'll see, kind of shaped the Byzantine and, Western Christianity for centuries to come. And Paul, you had mentioned something very interesting earlier, where he started building churches and places of worship as a part of his institutional power, which is very, very interesting. This really stuck out to me when I was doing my research, because essentially he's bankrolling the expansion of Christianity as like public works projects. So again, you see this coupling of public works with Christianity. He's getting that reinforced support from the Christian world within his empire, and he's bankrolling it. Like, again, political shrewdness, true believer. I don't know. Either way, genius move on his part.
Yeah, he's, again, putting his money where his mouth is. And you're right, he's stepping into these, again, if you're not a Christian, if you look into this whole Council of Nicaea, you're like, what on earth are they talking about? Who cares? But if you're a Christian, this is a deeply fundamental question about your religion. So, unless you're in it, you really don't get it. But once you're in it, you're like, this is everything. And, to be able to make sure that, the head of state is coming in to essentially moderate these types of discussions. And you're right, it's going to be something that Byzantine emperors and future Roman emperors are going to continue to do until the end of those respective empires. But to get to the point where he can do that at will, Licinius needs to be dealt with. And in 324, you get the Battle of Adrianople, you get the Battle of Chrysopolis, and finally, that decisive battle, he wins. They're fighting under the labarum, that symbol that he saw in the sky. And now Constantine is the sole emperor of the Roman Empire, and which is the first sole emperor in about 30 years. Because remember, we had the Tetrarchy for a long time. We've got usurpers who are kind of co-emperors with stuff, but about 30 years until we've had like a proper single emperor. And so at this point though, and remember, Richie, you mentioned, he held off his baptism because he wanted to be essentially be cleansed of his sins so he can go into heaven, all fresh. Well, let's see why he was probably smart to do that, depending on, what you believe in. But he essentially does a few things. Well, he first off shows mercy. He says, I'm not going to kill Licinius. That's silly. We were friends for a while. I'm not in the business of killing Roman emperors. I'm going to let you live out your days in a Greek city. Don't worry. No harm's going to come to you. A year later, yeah, I'm going to kill you, and I'm going to kill your generals because, you've been plotting you've been plotting treason, and, you're probably trying to kill me. And even he has Licinius' young son executed, who's Constantine's nephew, because remember, Licinius was married to his sister. And it's just one of these things where he's like, I just can't have this. So he tries to show some mercy, probably due to his sister's behest. But at this point, the Tetrarchy is dead. First emperor in 30 years, Tetrarchy is dead. It was a nice idea, but ultimately this is a autocratic military-based empire, and it ain't going to change anytime soon. So he's the sole emperor, and he's going to be sole emperor until his death. And really, this is where those policies kick into high gear. Churches are being built like crazy, reforms like crazy, and he's now seen as this patron and protector of the Christian faith across the empire. And so, everything seems like he's got it under control. But then this is where things get really dark, and we don't really understand why this happens, but it's really strange. In 326, Constantine has a son. His name is Crispus. And Crispus is actually being groomed to be his successor. He's in his early 20s. He's seen as being very capable, very good on the battlefield, a great administrator. And he also has his second wife, Fausta, who's, very close to him in this life. He has them both executed, which is just bizarre, to murder your son and your wife. And the rumors are that there was an affair of political intrigue, stepmother, stepson. Were they trying to overthrow Constantine? I think it's an old Roman trope of evil stepmother was pulling the strings and trying to get her son in power. We don't really know what happens, and we never will know. But to go to the level of killing your own son, like even by ancient standards, that's incredibly messed up. And we actually see Constantine have to go around and kind of do a bit of a road show, if you will, to kind of get his reputation back up, because people are looking at this going, oh my God, he murdered his own son and wife. Like, I know this is the ancient world where we do a lot of wacky things, but that's one thing that universally, everybody's going to look at it and say, that's an insane decision, and I can't believe he did that.
Yeah, I read, I tried to read a little bit into it to see if there was anything, but there's no real historical story that we can trust there. But yeah, the motif of stepmother, stepson is definitely there. Apparently there was a false accusation against his son for sexually assaulting his stepmother, and then he killed Crispus, and then he found out that she was lying, and then he murdered her. All in all, we don't know the truth, but then he had to go on this kind of propaganda mission to really suppress those stories and distance himself from that narrative, because obviously as this new kind of Roman Christian emperor, it's not gonna look too good.
No, definitely not. And again, Christian or not, it's not going to look good. But hey, again, welcome to the ancient world. Crazier things have happened. But like we said, he's now the sole ruler. And one of the big things that he does, like we said, is opening these new churches. And one of the big ones is he actually founds the old St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. So if you go to Rome today, the basilica that you see is built in the 1600s, something like that. And then obviously over a long time. But for about 1,000 years before that, this older basilica was placed there, erected over where St. Peter was traditionally buried. And so you see things like that. He declares Sunday as a Christian day of worship. He creates the Sunday law, basically saying, hey, you got to take it easy on a Sunday. This is a day for the Lord and for prayer and those sort of things. So again, this has not changed, and it probably will never change. And these are the things that he's starting to do. And he's starting to ban certain practices. So certain divination practices are banned. He bans crucifixion, which is the thing that Romans loved to do for a long time, was crucify people that were getting in their way. And now he's starting to mint coins. And like we said many times, coins are the ultimate way to share messages. There's no newspapers, radio, anything like that. The best way is everybody's got money. They got to pay for things. And if you put things on coins, people are going to see, people are going to understand your message. And he's starting to throw in those new symbols that he sees. He's really starting to he's actually using symbols of Sol Invictus, which is the unconquered sun god, which again is kind of a little bit of a medium between Christian God and old pagan god, and enough for people to not freak out too much. So there's little things like that, but we've really gone from this era of, we call it the age of martyrs, where a bunch of Christians refusing to give up their faith, killed in these persecutions, to a point of tolerance for Christians. And so Council of Nicaea happens, bishops are fighting all the time. Welcome to the next 1500 years of Christianity, fighting over trivial things and then separation. And there's an entire podcast series worth of stuff to talk about there. But let's get to the most cool thing for me is the founding of Constantinople. So we've been talking for so long, Rome is not a good power center anymore. It's purely spiritual at this point. And we've seen emperors up to this point. Diocletian was in Nicomedia, which is basically where Istanbul is today, but just on the other side of the Bosphorus Strait, so on the Asian side of Turkey. We see the Western Augustus actually working out of Milan, much in northern Italy, because they're dealing with frontier issues. It's not so much internal anymore. And so Constantine actually thought about making his capital in Nicomedia. He looked at Nicomedia and he said, it's a good city, but I don't see it as being unsiegeable. But when I look at a city called Byzantium, it's surrounded by water. It's surrounded by water, I should say, on like most sides. If you build one big, huge wall on the one side, it's going to be very hard to siege. You can resupply it from the water. It's a very small area to defend, so you can cut off trade. This is kind of the crossroads of the world. And he looks at it and goes, great, I'm going to build my city here. And so it essentially is considered the new Rome. It's the new capital city. He names it after himself, calling it Constantinople, and which is modern day Istanbul. And he says, all right, this is my new city. But there's a bit of a problem. Nobody lives there, really. A few 20,000, 30,000 people in Byzantium. Rome was the first city that we have records for that had over 1 million people. Some of these larger cities like Milan and Nicomedia and Antioch, hundreds of thousands of people. So he basically says, I need people. So he puts the word out. He's like, hey, come to this great new city called Constantinople. I'm building a bunch of cool stuff like churches and defenses and trade and admin buildings, and it's going to be great. And people are like, great, I'm going to come. But you have to remember, if somebody called you up today and said, hey, great, hey, guess what? I got a new city I'm building, on the other side of the world for some people, or 100 kilometers away. If you've got a good life where you're living, you're probably not going to uproot and go. But if you're if you've had issues with the law, if you're poor, you're not really sure what you want to do in your life, yeah, you're going to pick up and go. And so for the first bit of Constantinople, it wasn't, a beacon of morality, if you will, and civic virtue. It was a bit of a mess, if you will, of the people that were coming in. But hey, this is kind of how Rome was built. They brought a bunch of essentially thugs and criminals together, built this city, and it kind of worked. And that kind of was the same model for Constantinople. Yeah, it was a little tricky at the beginning, but eventually it worked. And you also have the backing of an entire empire to put money into the city. So that kind of starts off the building of probably one of the world's greatest cities that's ever been created, and will become the most important city in the Western world for the next 1,000+ years.
Yeah, and I think like politically or historically even, it becomes the beating heart of the Eastern Roman Empire for the next 1,000 years. It's going to outlive Rome by nearly a millennia. Religiously, it's going to emerge at this point in time, at least, as the center of Christian orthodoxy, where emperors and patriarchs are going to shape doctrine, sponsor councils, defend the faith. The city kind of embodies Constantine's vision of this Christian empire, or at least what it's going to be. It's, centralized, it's enduring, and to his contemporaries, stories of Constantine's, tracing the city walls, guided by an angel, reflected by this belief in kind of Constantinople's, you could call it a divine destiny in some way in establishing this new Rome. It's a very powerful narrative that again kind of couples him with this burgeoning faith of Christianity.
You're right. And we did a whole episode on this. Was the Christians were never truly defeated in the East until Mehmet took Constantinople. There was always it was the Byzantine Empire was a shell of its former self, but until that city was taken, you really couldn't, say that the Ottomans were truly successful in defeating the Christians. And, when that city fell, there's so many things that kind of kick off in the West and Europe of almost pure panic, because this is the unsiegeable city. This is the beating heart of Christianity, and it is gone now. It has fallen to the Muslims. And this is craziness. But this is the day it gets founded. And, it turns into this great kind of mega city for so many years. And that's really where Constantine's going to continue to rule from for kind of the rest of his life. Before we get to his death, though, there's one person I want to just talk about, and that's his mother, Helena. And Helena actually becomes Saint Helena, and she's known for kind of going on this famous pilgrimage to Jerusalem, where along the way she's founding churches and creates some of these great churches in Jerusalem and Bethlehem. And she even brings back what is considered part of the true cross, which becomes this great Christian artifact that is used for a long time. And so again, you're starting to see this become a family affair, and they're really trying to spread the word. And she just, is a key person, I think, in this entire story. And, alongside Constantine, she becomes canonized as a saint and has a feast day. And, as someone then, church historians look back, she's a key person within this role of, Christianization of the empire. But Constantine's getting to the end of his life here. And so now it's time for the classic. Who's going to take over? Well, I am getting older here. So the answer should have been Crispus, but Crispus is dead. And Constantine has a bunch of sons. They're all very young, 19, 20, some are even less than that. And he kind of just goes, all right, well, you get this, you get this, you get this. Oh, and I've also given 2 of your nephews some of this stuff. You guys are going to work this out? You guys are going to play nice? Great. All the power to you. Which, when I look at Constantine, look what he just came from. He saw the breakdown of the Tetrarchy. He knows that you can't just give 5 people power and expect them to play nice. And essentially that's what he does. He just kind of says, go for it. And guess what? It doesn't work out. And there's a bunch of civil war and assassinations and fighting, and there's really not much stability after he dies. But this is where I look at Constantine as, if there's some criticism to be thrown at him here, this is a massive misstep, because everything he's created, especially if he is a true believer in what he's built, stability is the most important thing that's going to come next here. And if he doesn't create that, there's a risk that everything he built will fall apart. And we see even later, there's an emperor called Julian the Apostate who actually tries to roll back some of the things Constantine does. And then Theodosius comes in and makes Christianity the full official religion of the empire. But, really not much planning here. And it's kind of odd to see that he just, I don't know if he didn't care, he didn't think about it, or just really wasn't interested in doing it. Or maybe he truly believed that, these are all my blood, they'll get along. The reason that didn't work last time was because we were all kind of, different people from different parents. But yeah, very odd kind of way of ending off his life, at least from a succession standpoint.
Yeah, you think he would have learned his lesson, but it's interesting. We'll never know. I think it's one of those mysteries of history that having come up in a world where a balance of power is such a tightrope to walk, and then just to divide it amongst 3 of your sons and 2 of your nephews under the pretense that because they fall under the same family name that they won't want to battle for supreme power, even though he did exactly what he's hoping they won't do, is, quite naive. Just one last closing thought here. So he's buried in Constantinople in the Church of the Holy Apostles with his sarcophagus among those of the 12 apostles. So symbolically making him the 13th, which I think is an interesting little takeaway.
Yeah, like you're talking about, there's really can't, after Jesus, it's the apostles who are next in Mary, I'm sure, from a Christian symbolism standpoint. So yeah, this is like you're putting yourself amongst the top brass of, Christian juggernauts here. And yeah, it's, the end of his life coming in, I believe it's 337.
Yep.
I just like to say he got baptized and went in clean. Good thing he did that with kind of everything that happened. But I just want to shift to his legacy a little bit here, because coming into this for me, I always put him in, hey, Constantine, one of the greatest Roman emperors of all time. And I think, I don't know if I would put him in this great category anymore, just based on everything we've seen. I think he's, in terms of influence, I don't think anybody really touches him outside of like some of the earlier emperors, like maybe Augustus, for example. Everything that he did to just shift the empire and really transform the way Western Europe and even the whole Mediterranean is going to change. The legacy and the impact is on another level. But when I really look at him as an emperor, I really see this abandoning of the Tetrarchy, like not even trying to keep it together, if you will. Now, again, is he really motivated by his religion and realizes that that's the only way to do it? Does he see the Tetrarchy as a failing system? Maybe. But I don't really think he leaves the empire in a better state than he inherited it. And I think that's always the way I like to judge emperors. Aurelian did it. Diocletian did it. Constantine changed things for sure. But is it better than what he did? And maybe it was already so good to begin with that it's hard to elevate it. But just, his succession planning and, just really pulling things back to that autocratic system that caused so many problems for so long. It's hard to say that, yeah, he's truly one of the greats. And that's where I kind of walk away from and maybe struggle a little bit with putting him in that great category, but influence and changing the world, no one even comes close.
Yeah, I'd agree with you. I think his legacy is so complicated. It's so multifaceted. I'm going to struggle to come away with a couple sentences. I think I'm not so much looking at it like good or bad. I think it's different. It's very different than we've looked at previously. And I think looking at what historians have said about him as historical research has gotten more into the modern era, I think people try to balance the extreme views of Constantine. How can you kind of balance how genuine his faith was? Did he use Christianity as a tool for unity? Was he just a shrewd tactician? He did execute his eldest son and his wife, which is pretty dark, even for the ancient times. But he also ended the age of martyrs, and he helped establish an enduring Christian empire. But on that same, on the flip side of that same coin, you have this thing that I've kind of dove into a little bit. It's called the Constantinian shift, and it kind of describes the church's alignment with state power that began under Constantine. So you see the politicization of religion, and if that's kind of setting the baseline for what we're going to see in the future, how good of a claim to fame is that when we see how messy that can actually get in the pre-modern and modern era. I think his legacy is extremely complicated, but it makes it so much more entertaining.
It really does. And I think that's so interesting. Like that whole shift is so monumental, and it's going to change things so significantly, and it's probably going to happen anyways. But I think the most impressive thing with him is the speed. Right. It just happens so fast, like within one person's lifetime, right? Like you said, the age of martyrs is over. The age of a Christian empire is begun and is going to continue to grow at an exponential rate for the next century. And then we're going to get to a point where it's like Rome and Christianity are kind of one and the same at this point. So it's so quick and it's so interesting. And like we talked about, it was a slow grind to get here, but man, did he just say, yeah, well, pedal to the metal, let's do this. And everyone's like, all right, I guess we're doing this. And that whole infrastructure around, like you said, the clergy finally, and we're going to get to the point where the clergy is going to be that third element outside of, nobility and the peasants to really bring us into this more medieval age that we're going to see within Europe. So yeah, totally fascinating times. And, I think we've got a pretty good foundation here on, we can probably jump into any point in the medieval period and be like, yeah, remember what Diocletian and Constantine did? Yeah, this is, you can thank them for, how everything is kind of coming together here. But there's a lot more that happens with Rome. I'm sure we'll get to, the fall of Rome and some of those other elements in future episodes. So stay tuned for that. But yeah, we'll be back with another episode in a couple of weeks, and want to thank you all for listening.
Until next time. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the History in Motion podcast. If you enjoyed our journey through time, please subscribe, rate us, and share the podcast with friends. Your support helps keep history alive. Until next time.